Episode 36, Part 03, Chapter 36. Chapter 36. It wasn't too long before everything was finally ready and the Jinan cargo ship finally set sail and headed off across the waters that would lead them to the other continent. It left behind Jinan and Midgar far behind, and within 20 to 30 minutes of sailing the continent could no longer be seen, and the only thing that surrounded the boat was ocean, carrying the Shinra and passengers that were hidden beneath its decks. Heidegger and Rufus were completely unaware of the presence of Cloud and his friends on board the ship, believing they had left them far behind on the continent they had just left. Little did they know that they were in fact on that very ship with them, walking around freely amongst the rest of the crew as though they were part of the Shinra themselves. Cloud eventually stepped out from behind the crates, reluctantly clipping his helmet back into place, but at least he had been able to sit without it for a while, and kept the visor up. They had been sailing for a good while now, but it would still be a good while before the other continent came into view and they could go ashore. Even though Red 13 had gone off in his own disguise, Cloud decided it would be a good idea to check up on the others and make sure they were all doing alright and blending in with the Shinra. Yuffie was the first person he spotted, probably because she was so easy to recognize. She was standing between a pile of crates near to where Cloud was, bent over and her head hidden, making a very peculiar growling and groaning sound. As Cloud walked over to her he immediately saw what was wrong with her. Her face was sickly pale and her hands were trembling. She spotted Cloud nearby and looked at him, before looking away again. Cloud looked on in sympathy. Travel sickness truly was a terrible thing to have, and terrible to combat once it started.
Erg.
She groaned, putting a hand on her stomach.
This is why I hate ships. Hey, Cloud. You have any tranquilizers?
Cloud shook his head.
Nope. Ugh, you don't have any.
Yuffie said. She turned back to the looking at the floor.
Unless it's an emergency, get away from me.
She told him harshly.
Where are the others? I dunno. Aren't they hiding somewhere around here? How should I know? Ugh. Erk.
Even as she fell down onto her knees on the verge of throwing up onto the ship floor, she continued to mumble to herself almost deliriously. The travel sickness was really getting to her head. Cloud knew why it was affecting her so bad. It was because she didn't have anything to do to keep her mind occupied and off the movement of the ship as it traveled over the water. If there was something for her to do other than sit and complain about how ill she felt, she would probably be fine. Cloud left Yuffie to her travel sickness and continued to look for the others. He had to make sure he didn't look too suspicious as he headed down through the lower decks, but as he did go on he soon figured out that he would have a problem. A lot of the people wandering around were dressed the same as he was in Shinra uniforms, and with the visors down it would be impossible to tell if any of the others were in disguise or not. He spotted one Shinra soldier heading cautiously towards him, and Cloud prepared to snap the visor down before they could see him clearly.
It's me, Eris,
the soldier said suddenly. Cloud stopped, his hand already on the visor panel. He recognized that voice. Sure enough, as the soldier lifted the visor, Cloud saw Eris hidden behind it, looking at him almost sheepishly. She looked equally relieved to see Cloud.
Hey, Cloud. Did you see the airship at Jinan?
Cloud nodded.
I heard it was big, but I didn't expect it to be that big. That was really something,
Eris said, her eyes looking dreamy for a moment.
Hey, do you think I could get on it?
Cloud nodded positively.
I'll take you someday. Keep hoping,
he told her.
Wow!
Eris exclaimed. She suddenly realized how loud she had yelled and quickly covered her mouth, her eyes darting round to see if she had attracted anyone's attention. When no one was looking, she lowered her voice to an excited whisper.
I'm really looking forward to it. Let's ride on the airship together, okay? Promise me.
The way she begged him to promise her made Cloud remember the way Tifa had made him promise, all those years ago, back in Nibelheim. In fact, there were a lot of similarities between Eris and Tifa, when he thought about it. Both of them ran into danger when there wasn't a real need for them to, like when Tifa joined him and Barrett on the Avalanche mission to destroy the No. 5 reactor, and how Eris followed them all the way to Sector 7 and ended up getting caught by the Shinra. Cloud and Eris then parted ways, Eris continuing her patrol of the lower decks to stop herself from arousing suspicion. There was only one room connected to the cargo room, but a soldier Cloud figured was not one of his friends guarded that room. With nowhere else to look on the lower decks, Cloud headed up the stairs to the upper deck. The sea air was extremely refreshing, and the sickening uncomfortable feeling Cloud had felt whilst wearing the almost suffocating visor disappeared in the salty breeze. Cloud stayed by the door for a moment, breathing in the clear air. He leaned over the side of the deck and looked out, but all he could see was water both to the front and to the back of the ship. Cloud stepped away from the deck and looked around for Tifa, Barrett, and Red 13. Most of the people on this deck were actual sailors and not Shinra soldiers, and looking around Cloud couldn't see any of the others disguised as sailors. At that moment his helmet gave a loud crack, and the sound rang through Cloud's ears. He turned in surprise as a small rock fell onto the floor behind him from where it had hit. Looking up, Cloud saw a Shinra soldier standing on the top of the lookout tower beside him, looking down at him. At least, it looked like a Shinra soldier, until the soldier gave him a quick wave and signaled him to come up. Cloud climbed up the ladder towards the soldier, who came to attention and saluted him.
"Yes, sir,"
came a female voice from behind the visor.
"Everything quiet, sir."
Cloud smiled as he recognized Tifa's voice.
"But you know what?"
she asked him.
"I really hate this uniform. Uniform, soldiers, war. I hate them all. They take away all the things and people you love. I wish they'd all disappear. Right, Cloud?"
Cloud nodded slowly.
"Yeah,"
he told her. It was a nice thought, to have a world without the need for war. Yet somehow he figured that wouldn't happen in the near future. Still, it comforted Tifa somewhat.
"You're right,"
she said. She looked around and then saluted at him again.
Yes sir. I'll continue my watch, sir. Hee hee."
Cloud saluted back at her and smiled, before heading back down the ladder towards the deck again. There was only Barrett and Red 13 left to find now, and it was Barrett he was most concerned about finding more than Red 13, who would have the most difficulty in disguising himself on the ship. Who knew what Barrett could be doing, on a ship filled with Shinra? He soon spotted Red 13, and Cloud had to stop himself from bursting out laughing. Red 13 was dressed as a Shinra soldier and was standing on the deck just outside the president's cabin. He was actually standing up on his two hind legs, trying to walk just like a human on those hind legs, but he was finding it difficult. Even as Cloud watched, he was wobbling across from one side of the deck to the other, trying his hardest to stay upright. His tail was also a pain to hide, and was sticking out of the back of the uniform. Luckily, no one was taking any notice.
"It's me, Red 13,
Red 13 said as Cloud wandered up, trying just as hard to keep the smile off his face. Red 13 looked down at himself and his wobbly form.
"I'm a little woozy, but I shouldn't get caught,"
he said.
"Humans only look at appearances anyway. Anyway you look at it, I'd say I make a fine human being."
He staggered a little and almost fell over, but just about managed to stay upright.
"It's pretty hard standing on 2 feet.
Cloud left Red 13 and began to search for Barrett, but he was nowhere to be seen on the upper decks. He even checked with Tifa again, but she hadn't seen him anywhere since they snuck aboard the ship during the parade. With nowhere else to look, Cloud went back down to the lower decks, wondering if he had missed Barrett on his way up. If Barrett couldn't be found, that was a major problem. The moment he came back down to the lower decks, Eris ran to him.
"Hey, Cloud,"
she said, her voice anxious.
"Did you see Barrett?"
The look on Cloud's face told her the answer, and she shook her head.
"I hope he's not doing something stupid."
Cloud was just as worried as she was. Barrett's temper was so volatile where the Shinra were concerned, and they didn't really want to make their presence known to the Shinra on a ship while it was in the middle of nowhere. He left Eris and moved back to the upper decks, becoming increasingly concerned as to where Barrett was. There was only one place on the ship he hadn't checked, and that was right at the front of the ship. As Cloud walked as casually as he could to the front of the ship, he quickly spotted Barrett. He was dressed in a sailor's outfit, and he looked very out of place, especially with his gun arm in the way. He was standing by the window of the president's cabin, peeking through at Heidegger and Rufus as they stood talking in the middle of the cabin, in plain view of Barrett. Barrett heard Cloud approaching and spun round, his arm ready, but when he saw it was Cloud, he relaxed and gestured to the window.
"Look, Cloud,"
he said harshly, and Cloud recognized the familiar tone of hatred in his voice that Priscilla had.
"It's Rufus and Heidegger. They're this close, but we can't do a thing to 'em."
Cloud walked up beside Barrett and looked through with him. He could see Heidegger talking to Rufus. He suddenly laughed heartily, despite Rufus's clear irritation. The moment Heidegger began to laugh, Barrett's face fumed until it was purple, hardly able to contain his rage.
GMMMMM.
He snarled under his breath as he glared at Heidegger's fat, laughing mug.
"How can he?" Going off Logan like that. Because of him, Biggs? Wedge? Jesse?
He growled fiercely. Suddenly he turned round and ran to the edge of the boat, shaking his fist angrily.
God!
He yelled.
I can't take it anymore. I'm gonna settle things here and now.
Cloud was about to protest to Barrett when all of a sudden an alarm began to ring loudly on every inch of the ship. The alarm rang loud and clear, making everyone on the ship freeze to the spot and fall silent. Moments later a voice began to boom out over the speakers, just over the sound of the alarm.
Emergency alert. Reports of a suspicious character found. Those not on detail, search the ship. Report when found. I repeat. Suspicious character found on board. Those not on detail, search the ship. Report when found.
Rufus and Heidegger left the cabin immediately after the alarm sounded, Rufus being ushered off to a safer area of the ship. With them gone, Barrett and Cloud around anxiously as the alarm continued to sound around them, wondering if they had somehow been spotted despite their efforts.
Damn, did they find us?
Barrett demanded. He stopped for a moment and scratched his head, thinking about what the alarm had said.
Hey, that don't seem like us.
He said.
Do they mean Tifa and the others?
He jumped up and turned to Cloud.
Get off your spiky butt and let's go, Cloud.
The two turned and dashed off back to the main part of the upper deck. They were surprised to find all of the ship personnel gone. They were probably all on the lower decks searching for the suspicious character. One thing they did notice, however, were that the others were all running onto the upper decks, and they all met up in the center of the deck.
Everyone all right?
Called Tifa.
You all right?
Said Barrett in turn. They all fell silent for a moment as they looked around at one another. Each and every one of them was present and correct, even Yuffie, who had managed to pry herself away from her travel-sick corner during the commotion.
Hey?
Eris asked, confused.
Everyone's here. Right?
Asked Tifa.
Hey, wait,
Barrett said suddenly, a realization coming to mind.
You don't think that suspicious character is Sephiroth?
Tifa jumped.
Really? How the hell am I supposed to know?
Barrett demanded angrily.
Let's find out,
said Cloud. One by one everyone turned and looked at him. If Sephiroth was indeed aboard the ship, then the lives of everyone aboard could be in danger, and anyone who did find him would surely be killed. That chilling thought sent shivers down everyone's spines, and they were filled with a cold dread. Until then they had just been chasing Sephiroth, but now the thought that now they were within reach of him. It scared them just a little bit.
It's the most logical thing to do,
Red 13 said, breaking the silence that had spread amongst them. Even so, Yuffie backed off a little away from them.
Not me.
She stammered nervously, shaking her head fiercely.
I don't even like Sephiroth anyway. And Bisid. Ugh. Irk.
Everyone watched as she covered her mouth again, before she suddenly turned and ran to the edge of the deck, finally giving in to her sickness and throwing up over the side of the ship. Cloud looked down and shook his head, when Tifa suddenly walked forward towards him.
Take me with you,
she said to him fearlessly. She gave Cloud a smile, trying hard not to let the fear break through.
I'm going to,
Barrett announced, raising his gun high. Red 13 also stepped forward.
These clothes are too tight on me,
he said.
Can I switch with you?
Cloud nodded and looked around as Eris also stepped forward. That was pretty much everyone. It looked like they were going to face Sephiroth after all. They hurriedly discarded their Shinra disguises, everyone glad to be finally out of the stifling uniforms, and headed towards the open door leading to the lower decks. Cloud stopped for a moment and looked back at Yuffie, who was still hanging over the bar looking into the water. Shaking his head he walked over to her, grabbed her by the back of her shirt, and dragged her with him towards the lower deck, ignoring her pleas for him to stop. As they descended down the stairs towards the lower decks, they noticed that it was unusually quiet. There was no sign of Rufus or Heidegger, in fact there was no sign of any of the ship's crew. Apart from the gentle hum of the engine and other engine sounds, there were in fact no other sounds to be heard throughout the whole ship. They reached the bottom of the stairs and immediately saw the reason for the eerie silence. In front of them and all around them there were soldiers and sailors strewn everywhere, thrown aside like rag dolls across the crates and over the metal floor. Tifa immediately ran forward to the nearest soldier lying close to the bottom of the stairs and knelt beside him. His visor was smashed and glass had cut into his face, but as Tifa checked his neck for a pulse she gave a sigh of relief. Most of the soldiers and sailors weren't dead, thankfully, although they were badly wounded. They would probably pull through, which was a relief. Barrett moved past the injured soldiers towards the crates, and pulled off the lid of one of them. Tifa helped him as he delved into the crate and pulled out their weapons, which had been stored in there out of sight for safekeeping. Cloud's sword, Ares' staff, Yuffie's shuriken, all of the weapons were safe. The three took their weapons gladly, and then turned towards the door leading to the engine room, and passed through. The moment they passed through the doors into the engine room they immediately felt a strong sense of evil hanging in the air. There were more soldiers lying either dead or unconscious on the upper levels, leaving the engine completely unattended. There was but one soldier left standing at the far end of the engine room, looking away from Cloud and the others as they entered and staring at the wall.
Is it Sephiroth?
Cloud said aloud, his voice seeming out of place in the silence. As the echo of his voice reverberated off the walls and began to fade, the solitary soldier slowly turned and faced them. His face was blank and expressionless, his eyes empty, and with a single line of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. The others watched as he then fell forward helplessly onto his knees and then face down onto the floor. He was already dead. Cloud shook his head in disbelief.
No. Not Sephiroth. After a long sleep. The time. Time has come.
All at once everyone jumped and turned their heads round and round, looking around the room for the source of the unknown voice. The voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, with nothing to indicate where it might have come from. They looked round and round, until Ares suddenly pointed straight ahead of them to where the soldier had fallen.
Look, Cloud.
Everyone turned and looked ahead to where Ares was pointing. As they watched, the floor around where the soldier had fallen began to ripple and waver slightly, and a shadowy figure slowly began to rise up from beneath it. The moment Cloud laid eyes on that figure he felt his blood boiling inside him. It may have been 5 years, but he would recognize Sephiroth anywhere. He hadn't changed one bit since Cloud had last seen him, apart from the fact that his green eyes seemed tired and heavy as he hovered in the air ahead of him, his head lowered to look at the ground. Sephiroth slowly lifted his head, seeming almost weary, and looked at the group through tired eyes.
Sephiroth!
Cloud exclaimed.
You're alive!
Sephiroth blinked sleepily and peered closely at Cloud without even a flicker of recognition appearing in his eyes. Looking back into those same eyes, Cloud could feel the rage rising in him. It was the exact same rage that Barrett felt whenever he thought about the Shinra, the same rage Priscilla felt when she thought about what the Shinra had done to the port town of Junon and its once beautiful waters. Locking gazes with Sephiroth brought back all that rage and hatred, as well as the painful memories that went with them. He could almost feel the heat of the flames again, but that was just his blood boiling in his veins. Yet with all that rage and anger, it couldn't prepare him for what Sephiroth was about to ask him.
Who are you?
He asked. Cloud shook his head in complete disbelief.
You don't remember me?
He asked back fiercely, unable to believe what he was hearing. How could he, just how could he, after all that had happened back in Nibelheim, forget who he was? His fist tightened around the handle of his sword.
I'm Cloud. Cloud?
Sephiroth repeated. He looked down at the ground again and closed his eyes. The name didn't seem to strike a chord with him, but he seemed so drowsy at that particular moment that it wasn't a surprise that he couldn't remember Cloud immediately.
Sephiroth!
Cloud yelled at him angrily, trying to get through to Sephiroth.
What are you thinking? What are you doing?
Sephiroth didn't answer him, and ignored his question. Instead, he began to breathe in deeply, slowly lifting his head to look up at the ceiling of the engine room. His tired eyes seemed to brighten up a little as he breathed in, the air finally waking him up to everything that was around him. It was as though he was just waking up from his long sleep, and finally beginning to take notice.
The time is now,
he said. Even his voice seemed awake now.
What? What are you saying?
Cloud demanded, fed up with Sephiroth's nonsense.
Be more.
He never had the chance to say any more, because very suddenly Sephiroth flew forward with amazing speed. He zipped right past Cloud and the others with such surprising force that they were all knocked back from the sheer impact alone. Without even pausing, Sephiroth turned and flew upwards towards the ceiling away from them. A bright flash followed as he neared the top of the engine room, and something dropped down towards them. Sephiroth then disappeared, leaving the group alone with the item he had dropped. It looked somewhat like a tentacle or an arm of sorts, covered in thick flesh and seeming to have been cut from something. It was also alive, for just as the group began to climb to their feet, the tentacle suddenly began to swish and flip around the floor with a mind of its own. It slowly flipped back and forth like a fish out of water, and Yuffie and Eris were forced to back up against the wall as it slid slowly over towards them.
"That smell,"
said Red 13 as he sniffed the air. He shook his head and glared furiously at the tentacle.
"It is an evil smell."
Barrett cautiously stood up and headed over towards the tentacle as it flopped about the floor, his gun arm raised and ready to shoot the thing if it made any other sudden movements. As he drew closer to it, Cloud began to feel a sense of apprehension and dread, as though he could feel the wicked vibes that were radiating from it. Red 13 was right. It was evil. In a flash of realization so strong it felt as though he had been hit by a truck, Cloud suddenly looked up at Barrett.
"Barrett! Get back!"
he yelled. Barrett jumped away just in time and fell against the wall. At that very moment when Cloud had called out to him, the thick, fleshy skin that covered the tentacle suddenly burst open without warning and unleashed several beams of purple-black light. Dark blood began to ooze thickly from the wound and spread slowly across the floor into a large puddle. The skin seemed to come alive on its own, beginning to open up and unfold of its own free will. Its fleshy complexion suddenly began to bubble and burn, as though acid had been poured on it. The burning released a powerful stench into the air, and hot steam began to rise up and shroud the tentacle from view. The cloud grew taller and taller until it reached the ceiling, and a tall silhouette appeared within it. The silhouette had a large, bulky body, with a small head that turned back and forth in the cloud of steam. It finally locked its shadowy gaze on Cloud. Cloud had been gripping onto the handle of his sword right then, watching with anger as the shadow began to rise in the steam. Yet as he felt the shadowed gaze of the creature lock gazes with him, Cloud felt an instant of hesitation. His blood ran cold only for a moment, feeling like a wave of pins and needles spreading across his body and making it ache. The sense of pure evil that radiated from this creature was incredible. Even so, it lasted only a moment, and Cloud narrowed his eyes, unafraid. End of chapter. Episode 37, Part 03, Chapter 37. Chapter 37. The steam finally began to thin and disperse, slowly revealing the creature that had been born from the acidic mist. Its shadow became a visible form that sent powerful waves of evil throughout the air, standing well over 10 feet tall so that the top of its body nearly touched the ceiling of the engine room. It was clear from its overall appearance that it was no ordinary monster. They had never seen a creature like it before. Its body was made up of thick, rubbery skin that was deformed and disjointed with no real correlation. It had elongated shoulders that stretched out wider than humanly possible, the ends spreading like spider webs tipped with tentacles that curled round like claws. It had but one tentacle-like arm, the other looked like it had been ferociously torn off to leave but a few long strands of loose flesh that wriggled round of their own free will. Below its thin waist its body spread out again as though wearing a fleshy dress, with a single tentacle-like tail. Lastly there was its face, set in deep on a long, craned neck that looked down at the group. That face was thin and bony, unusual after seeing the loose flesh covering the rest of his body. Its black eyes glared out emptily at the group one by one. Those eyes. They had intelligence, nothing that any real monster had ever truly shown before. It really was no ordinary monster. Stretching and raising its fleshy arms, the creature let out a furious, heart-clenching screech. The sound echoed throughout the engine room as well as the lower decks of the ship. Lifting up its thick tail off the ground, it pointed the tip towards Cloud and Tifa, who were the closest to it. The tail's tip began to glow brightly, before a beam of light abruptly burst out from the tail and zipped towards them. Cloud and Tifa jumped away from each other as the light struck the ground where they had stood, letting it fire into the ground. The laser pierced the metal with ease, the edges around where the light went through melting and curling in on itself from the intense heat. The laser continued to move across the floor towards the body of the fallen guard. It missed him only by inches and stopped just before hitting the wall where the engines were built. The creature's tail twitched violently as a parade of bullets suddenly flung through the air and struck its hideously malformed side. Sprays of green-black blood oozed from the wounds and slid down the creature's side. The creature shrieked again, the ground quaking beneath its flat, seemingly footless body. It slowly began to turn, a squelching sound coming from beneath it as it moved, the blood trickling down towards the metal floor. It eventually stopped as it faced Barrett, who had moved away from the wall and was standing directly behind it, his gun arm aiming for its head. He immediately opened fire as the creature turned, and the bullets powered up to its already deformed face. The creature moved away in time, but at least 2 bullets connected with the side of its face. They seemed to cut right through with ease and sunk deep into the skin, as though there was no bone to cut through. The rest of the bullets missed completely and hammered into the back wall. The creature seemed to grin a large, black grin and began to advance on Barrett, its tail sliding silently behind it. It raised its one good tentacle arm, the tip glowing, and prepared to bring it down on Barrett. Red 13, unable to watch any more, leaped up from the ground and clamped his jaws firmly around the tentacle's arm. His sharp fangs sunk deep into the flesh, surprised at the firmness of it. A sour taste of rot and decayed flesh hit his senses and he almost let go, but he just curled his tongue back as far as it would go and held on. The creature, enraged by Red 13's attack, swung its arm furiously in an attempt to throw him off. It lifted its tentacle arm high up into the air and swung it round, but Red 13 simply dug his claws into the arm, wrapped his tail around for extra support and held on. Temporarily distracted in its quarrel with Red 13, it was time for the others to attack. Barrett opened fire again, sending more bullets up into the air. The creature's body shuddered again as more bullets were flung into its flesh, allowing more green-black blood to pour from its side. In response, the creature raised its tail and moved it forward between itself and Barrett, shielding itself from the bullets. Its tail was made of thicker, firmer flesh, and the bullets found it much harder to penetrate. Of course, lifting up its tail made the back of the creature bare and very exposed to a direct rear assault. Cloud was kneeling on the ground right then, where he and Tifa had fallen after dodging the creature's tail laser. Standing up, he lifted his sword and darted forward, leveling the sword in front of him. He then thrust it forward and buried it deep in the open flesh of the creature's back, even if he could only reach up to its lower waist. His blade sunk in only halfway, beyond that the flesh became more compact and harder to push the blade through. Feeling the blade's sharp edges inside of it, the creature roared angrily. In retaliation, it flipped its tail back with amazing force. Barrett ducked in time for the tail to move over his head, but with his blade still stuck in the creature's side, Cloud couldn't move away, and the tail struck him hard as it spun round. The blade came out as Cloud was thrown back to the far wall, where he crashed against it and fell to the ground, the sword clattering at his feet. Tifa immediately ran to his side and knelt beside him. Retaliating from Cloud's assault, the deformed creature swung its arm around and threw Red 13 against the wall. A loud crack sounded throughout the room as Red 13 was slammed against the wall and released, also falling to the floor. While the creature's arm was suspended in the air, a quick flash of metal zipped through the air, and the creature roared as its arm fell cleanly from its body and onto the floor, allowing even more blood ooze onto the floor. The creature thrashed and writhed, its roars almost ear-piercing, while the shuriken flew back like a boomerang through the air to Yuffie's hand where she was waiting for it. It was then that the final direct assault took place. Barrett, safe in his position, opened fire at the open wound of its arm where the flesh was ruptured and soft. Red 13 clambered to his feet and leaped up the side of the creature's body, dodging the bullets, and attacked its face directly, clawing and scratching and biting wherever he could. Yuffie guarded Eris, throwing her shuriken so that it whipped round and cut more holes in the flesh. It was enough. A final cry of despair and pain made Barrett and the others all stop their attacks and step back. The creature's entire body shuddered before them like an out-of-control fit. Blood ran down over almost every inch of its body, its already misshapen form even more deformed by bullets, claws and blades. More smoke then began to seep out of those wounds, the same color as before, and began to envelope the creature once again. Inside the cloud the creature roared, its silhouette burning as though on fire, until its cry and its form seemed to fade into nothing. The smoke slowly evaporated, and the echo of its cry died down to nothing and left the engine room quiet, bar for the rumble of the engine. For a moment or two no one said anything, catching their breath after the creature's disappearance. Tifa was still kneeling by Cloud, tying a bandage from her own wrists around his wrist where the metal wall had cut through when he fell. All that remained of the creature to prove of its existence was the same arm-like tentacle that had been cut clean off by Yuffie's shuriken, although this time it wasn't wriggling or flopping. Now it was lying dead and motionless on the ground in a pile of ooze, a single ball of red materia lying silently next to it. "Ew!" Yuffie squealed, her bones turning to jelly as she looked at the disgusting pile of flesh in the middle of the engine room.
"What is it? Gross."
Everyone gathered around the dead tentacle arm, including Tifa and Cloud, after Cloud assured her that his wrist was only scratched and not badly hurt. They all looked down at the pile of dead mottled flesh, unable to fight the feeling that they knew who or what the creature had been.
"I've seen this somewhere
before," said Tifa, confirming everyone's thoughts.
"That's what disappeared from the Shinra building,"
said Red 13. Cloud knelt down beside the immobile arm, unsure whether or not to touch it to make sure that it truly was dead and the creature would not be reborn from it. Red 13 was very observant, and had made the same connection as he did.
Genova,
he said, his voice very low.
The arm of Genova.
The name sent chills down everyone's spine. Apart from Yuffie, they all knew what Genova was. Genova was the strange, headless creature that had been locked away in the Shinra Science Laboratory. At least, that was until Sephiroth appeared and released it, dragging it away from the headquarters. Cloud had almost forgotten about Genova, the ancient who was Sephiroth's mother. Except the creature they had just fought was certainly not headless. It had been alive and intact.
Genova,
muttered Barrett, the sick taste of disgust in his mouth.
You mean he's been walking around with that thing?
He watched, as Cloud stood up mechanically, his Mako eyes almost blank as he became lost in thought.
So it was Sephiroth,
he said. Those words were the realization that everyone had feared. Somehow they had hoped, by some weird miracle, that Sephiroth was indeed dead and all the rumors were just rumors. Yet now it seemed that Sephiroth was alive, and they had seen it with their own eyes. Tifa secretly clenched her fists tightly in anger as her memories of Sephiroth haunted her. The memories that made her move to Midgar, where her only surviving friends still lived. Now she was being forced to relive those memories again.
He said something about it being time for something,
she said, trying to shake off the painful memories. She couldn't afford to lose herself to the fear that this could lead to her losing more people that she cared about.
Time is now,
Cloud said, repeating Sephiroth's words. They made no sense, but that was no surprise. Sephiroth had seemed to be in some sort of trance throughout the whole meeting. Eris scratched her head.
I don't get it,
she said, giving up.
Hey, Cloud, can you explain it to us?
Behind her, Yuffie nodded her head vigorously, clearly the most confused out of everyone since they had had little time to explain everything to her. Cloud sighed heavily. He was just as confused.
I'll try,
he said.
But don't interrupt me while I'm explaining.
He took a moment to collect his thoughts, then breathed deeply before beginning to explain the events so far.
Sephiroth went off searching for the Promised Land, so he could become the ruler of the planet. That was 5 years ago. Then Sephiroth came back and killed President Shinra. And then just now all of us saw Sephiroth. He was carrying Genova with him. This much I do know. He told me he wants to go to the Promised Land with his mother, Genova.
He shrugged.
I guess that's about it.
He stopped as the speaker above them crackled into life, and the strong but still anxious voice of the ship's announcer rang throughout the ship, making them all jump violently.
Dock workers, we will be docking in Costa del Sol in 5 minutes. Prepare for docking.
Everyone immediately sighed with relief, glad to hear that news. Clearly everything was back to normal on the ship, despite the battle that had gone on below. Pretty soon they would be back on dry land and away from the cluttered, claustrophobic decks of the ship. Hopefully away from Sephiroth and the Shinra as well, although they knew that would be too much to hope for.
Maybe we shouldn't stay in here anymore,
Eris said as the voice of the announcer died down. One by one everyone nodded and headed towards the door, Cloud picking up the ball of materia as he went. Inside the new materia, also summoning materia dropped by Genova, was the image of the fiery beast known as Ifrit. Cloud pocketed it and went to the door as Tifa walked out, before stopping and looking back at the emptiness of the engine room. Soon the ship staff would find the bodies of the workers in here, and he wondered whether Shinra would blame it on them or Sephiroth.
Sephiroth is alive. The Promised Land. Does it really exist?
He looked around one more time, until he finally turned around and left the engine room and its lost souls behind. Costa del Sol. It wasn't long before the shores of the next continent finally came into view, just as the announcer had promised. It was still a few minutes before the port town came into view, much to the immense relief of the sailors who had all gathered on deck to watch it grow into view. Slowly but surely, there it was. The port town and popular holiday resort of Costa del Sol, the opposite partner of Junon, where the two continents connected through this one main ship line. Seeing the town with its long, sandy beaches and clear, lustrous waters was such a wonderful sight to the tired sailors. After the alarm had sounded and the bodies discovered, every one of them had become very anxious to get off the ship and onto the safety of the land again. Finally, the Shinra ship pulled into the dock, its engines grinding as they came to a stop. The anchor, previously hanging against the side of the ship's frame, was lowered carefully into the water so that it would hold the ship still and prevent it from drifting off into the ocean again. There were a number of small motorboats docked in the quay, but the Shinra ship was the only large ocean-going vessel. It caught the attention of the locals and holiday makers who were bathing on the smaller boats, dressed in as little clothing as possible to soak up the sun. They all stood up in their boats and looked as the ship stood silent in the water. Once all the sailors were out of sight inside the ship preparing to leave, a small door on the deck of the ship opened up beside the stairs that led down to the dock. Cloud and his team ran out of that doorway and down the stairs, hoping to make a quick and quiet escape before Rufus and the Shinra could spot them. One by one they ran out of the door and onto the dock. They were immensely glad to feel the hot sun against their skin, warming them up within the space of a few seconds and relieving the horribly cramped feeling they had had in the depths of the boat. Even Yuffie, who had chosen to make her exit by jumping off the top of the boat and down to the dock, was no longer feeling seasick. In fact, she was so perky that when she landed on the dock she ran around as though checking everything out, before she ran back to join Cloud and the group at the edge of the dock. As she joined the group once again, she saw that their relief of being back in the sunshine was quickly dissipating. Costa del Sol was a holiday town as well as a port, and the sun was very, very hot. So hot in fact that the group were already beginning to sweat.
Damn! Sure is hot here.
Barrett exclaimed.
But I sure feel better now that I can say goodbye to that sailor suit.
Beads of sweat trickled profusely across the black skin of his face and arms. He wiped his face and snarled at how wet it was. He shook his hand vigorously, shaking off the sweat drops.
Yo, listen up.
He added suddenly, seeming to take charge again.
Y'all be sure to mingle like regular folks here.
To one side Tifa rolled her eyes, while Eris sidled over to Barrett and stood close next to him with a sly smile on her face.
Oh, too bad,
she said. She looked up at Barrett and fluttered her eyelids.
I liked Barrett's sailor suit. He looked so cute.
Barrett stared down at Eris, who continued to look up at him with a strange smile on her face. Around him he could hear the giggles of Tifa and Yuffie, as well as the stifled laughs of Cloud and Red 13. He muttered, looking around at the others forcing back their laughs. He snapped round back to Eris, his eyes flared despite the sweat pouring down him.
What you mean cute? Right. Well,
Tifa stammered. She hoped to calm down the situation before Barrett exploded, for the veins in his neck were already flared to the maximum.
Barrett, why don't you use that sailor suit for pajamas? Right, Cloud? I guess,
Cloud replied absently. Then, realizing Tifa had dropped him in it, he quickly shook his head.
AHHH. You look like a bear wearing a marshmallow. The hell's that supposed to mean?
Roared Barrett, his fists up in the air ready to bring them down on Cloud and wipe the smirk off his face.
This happens to be the most comfortable, so shoo up. Would you kindly hurry?
Red 13 said suddenly. He was crouched very low on the floor, his paws barely visible beneath his bulk, his tail lying flat against the floor, and he was panting heavily.
The heat here is drying my nose. Yeah, mine too,
said Yuffie, her hands covering her nose from the sun, and jumping up and down. Cloud ignored Yuffie's statement, not even bothering to consider how her nose could be drying up like Red 13's, and nodded his head.
All right. We'll take a break and then head off. Don't wander too far off,
he added sternly.
I'll wander wherever I damn well want,
Barrett snapped. To prove his point, he ran off towards the town, leaving Cloud and his group behind without even a glance back. Cloud shook his head, and looked down as he saw Red 13 slowly crawling past his feet. The mammal's feet were shuffling incredibly slowly across the floor as though he could hardly even move, and his fur was already damp and clammy.
It looks like my mane got messed up,
was all he said as he crawled by.
I'm going to rest somewhere cool. Don't bother looking for me,
exclaimed Yuffie, and she quickly spun round and ran off. Cloud didn't even bother thinking where she would go. Somewhere with a lot of materia, most likely. He did wonder why she had made it her mission to travel with them. There was no motivation in her reasons. At least, not the same motivation as him and his friends.
I think I'll go swimming,
Tifa said suddenly, looking at Eris.
Sounds good to me,
Eris replied with a grin. After all, Costa del Sol was a holiday down. Eris then stopped as another sly grin appeared on her face, and she ran over to Cloud.
Cloud, are you thinking of anything in particular? Your cool exterior's cracking.
Cloud almost choked and glared at Eris in surprise and shock. His face, already reddened by the heat, turned to a deep crimson and Cloud had to quickly turn away to hide the embarrassment. Eris just laughed, pleased that Cloud had reacted the way she had hoped.
Well then, let's go,
she said, turning back to Tifa, who was giggling. The two girls then ran off laughing into the town, leaving Cloud behind on the dock. After taking a minute to cool down and return his skin to its normal color, Cloud then made his exit from the dock and headed into the town. He left just in time, too. Moments after Cloud disappeared from the dock, a helicopter bearing the Shinra logo flew in from the outside of the town and headed straight towards the dock. It moved over to a helipad at the far end of the dock, hovered for a second, before slowly lowering itself onto the pad. Its long tracks settled onto the pad, and the chopper blades slowly stilled. Only then did the doors to the ship open once again, and Rufus and Heidegger exited from the ship, along with two sailors who were very relieved to be back on dry land.
What a long boat ride that was!
One of the sailors exclaimed. He took a deep breath, glad to feel its freshness, although it was still quite salty from being so close to the sea. Still, he was on land again, and that was all that mattered. Rufus said thoughtfully. He looked around the dock, obviously looking for someone, but he couldn't see them anywhere.
Good work everyone,
he said instead.
Yeah, ha, ha. Ha.
Heidegger coughed, catching the very angry glare from Rufus as he began to laugh again. He stammered nervously under his breath, before turning towards the helicopter.
Hurry up with that,
he shouted.
Yes sir,
replied the pilot, who was standing beside the helicopter. He saluted and quickly ran back to work, preparing the helicopter for takeoff again. Satisfied that the helicopter workers were now working instead of standing around, Heidegger turned back to Rufus. The Shinra president was standing with his arms folded and his head lowered in thought. There was also a frown on his face, so clearly he was thinking about what had happened on the ship. When the alarm had sounded, Rufus had been rushed off to the emergency cabin to safety, and there he had stayed until the ship speaker had announced their arrival at Costa del Solution. He hadn't been able to see the sailors removing the bodies of the few that were dead, but he had heard the terrified rumors rushing among the sailors.
I heard Sephiroth was on board,
he said suddenly, not lifting his head or looking at Heidegger. Heidegger froze, his voice stuttering a reply.
Yes,
was all he could muster.
And it seems Cloud and the others were on board, too.
Yes, Heidegger said again, hanging his head.
They all slipped through,
Rufus said quietly. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking it all through and letting Heidegger sweat at the thought of what Rufus would do. There was no doubt in Rufus's mind that Cloud and the others had already escaped the ship and were hiding in Costa del Sol, if they hadn't gone on ahead of them already.
You messed up big this time, Heidegger. I'm ashamed of myself,
Heidegger replied pitifully, trying to make himself sound as pathetic as possible. Rufus slowly opened his eyes and looked at Heidegger in disgust.
Is that all you can do?
He asked.
Give one-word answers and apologize for everything.
He got no reply from Heidegger, but it was clear from the look on his bearded face that he was shocked, and couldn't look at the president, deliberately turning his head away so Rufus couldn't see.
Ready for departure, sir,
came the pilot's voice from across the dock. Rufus nodded and turned towards the helicopter. He was about to pass Heidegger, when he suddenly stopped and gave him a sideways glance.
Do something,
he ordered sternly under his breath.
I'll be expecting results.
Heidegger continued to say nothing as Rufus walked past him and headed towards the helicopter. Once Rufus was far enough away from him, Heidegger turned sharply towards the two sailors who were standing near to the edge of the dock. Catching Heidegger's angry gaze, one of the soldiers panicked and ran quickly, but Heidegger quickly cornered him at the edge. Without a single care for the sailor's well-being, he pushed the sailor harshly into the water. The sailor landed with a cry and a large splash, sending spray up into the air. Heidegger then grabbed the second sailor, who knew better than to run, and threw him into the water also, creating another large spray of water. Once he was done with the sailors, Heidegger snapped round and turned towards the group of bathers who were watching from the presumed safety of their boats. All of the bathers panicked and ran inside their cabins as Heidegger stormed towards them like an out-of-control bull, but Heidegger stopped at the edge and shook his fists, cursing loudly at them. The sound of the helicopter blades made him stop, and he turned just in time to see the helicopter rise off the helipad and into the air. He could just see Rufus in the passenger seat of the chopper, not even looking down at Heidegger as the helicopter turned and flew off away from Costa del Sol, leaving him behind. End of chapter. Episode 38, Part 03, Chapter 38. Chapter 38. Cloud was quite amazed as he walked through the streets of Costa del Solution. There were very few places left in the world untouched by the Shinra and their Mako reactors, but Costa del Sol was one of them. Unlike dark and dreary city of Midgar and port town of Junon, or even the lonely and quiet village of Calm, Costa del Sol was a bright and vibrant place, filled with people enjoying the sunshine and the sights. Cloud figured he had probably been to Costa del Sol before, probably on his way to Nibelheim all those years ago, but he didn't remember much about it. As he crossed the bridge that led from the dock, he could easily see the difference between Junon and Costa del Solution. There were luxurious villas lined up between the dock and the shore, still looking brand new and very tempting to buy. Most visitors ended up buying a villa at some time or another, although they were very expensive. Cloud could see one up for sale just ahead of time, with a sign in the window with the price 300,000 gil written on it. Only the very wealthy could buy a villa like that, although Cloud was very tempted. Villa Cloud. It was a nice thought. He headed down towards the town. He began to feel very out of place in his purple uniform and armor, and his large sword hung behind his back. All of the other people in Costa del Sol were dressed in bikinis or swimsuits, for it was much too warm for anything else. Cloud hung his head and sighed heavily, feeling very inadequate. He looked up suddenly as a red ball suddenly moved past his feet, and was even more startled when a young boy ran carelessly up in front of him and skidded to catch the ball. The boy caught the ball with his feet but fell back, losing his balance on the sandy floor. He fell back against Cloud's legs, where Cloud pushed him upright again. The boy didn't look back or say thank you as he pushed away from Cloud and kicked the ball hard towards one of the smaller, cheaper villas before running out to join his friend. At least, it looked like he was kicking it to the villa. As Cloud looked up, he saw Red 13 sitting under the shade of the villas, away from the sunlight. He looked like he was half asleep, but Cloud could see that his one good eye was open slightly, looking out attentively as his tail swished gently back and forth, hitting the ball back towards the playing children. It looked very odd, for it looked as though Red 13 wasn't giving it any attention or will. Curious, he walked over to Red 13. The dog-like creature barely looked much better now that he was in the shade, but he still didn't look up at Cloud.
That's interesting,
Red 13 mumbled softly to Cloud, looking at his tail flick the ball back to the boys.
It's not as if I'm doing this because I want to. You see, this tail of mine moves quite independently of my will.
As if to prove his point, he yawned very loudly and shut his eye. Cloud watched as the boys kicked the ball back over, and was surprised to see Red 13's tail twitch and catch the ball easily, flicking it back again. It really did have a mind of its own. Again, he wondered just what kind of creature Red 13 was, but it wasn't really that important.
Come on, everyone. Just take a look at this.
Cloud froze instantly. That high-pitched, hyper-sounding voice. He prayed that his mind was only playing tricks on him, and the voice didn't belong to whom he thought it belonged to. He turned away from Red 13, who by now was dozing in the shade, and slowly turned his head towards the stalls at the west of the town. His gaze fell on one stall in particular, and he almost dropped to the ground.
Oh, no.
He was looking at the materia stall, which sold some nice but common forms of materia. To Cloud's horror but to no surprise he saw that Yuffie was standing behind the stall, an apron around her waist, calling out to potential customers passing by. So much for keeping a low profile, Cloud thought to himself. Even so, Yuffie seemed to be doing a good job, for there was a small crowd gathering around the stall.
Take a look at this awesome materia,
Yuffie announced, lifting up a green ball from the stall, her eyes flashing with the light shining through the ball from the sun.
Hey, mister. You want to buy this? I know you want to.
Cloud sauntered over to the stall, peering over the small crowd as Yuffie lowered the ball of materia back to the stall to present another one. As Yuffie put her arms beneath the stall, he thought he saw her slip the materia into her pocket, but he couldn't be sure. She grinned happily at the crowd around her, seeming to be enjoying herself. Even Butch, the owner of the materia stall, looked pleased.
Well, we're lucky to have that cutie working for us part-time,
he was saying to another customer. Part-time? Cloud figured that Yuffie had no intention of staying in Costa del Sol working for the stall. She was a materia hunter, not a materia seller. He probably did see her sneaking materia into her pockets, and Butch would realize that he wasn't as lucky as he thought.
Ah, Cloud.
Yuffie called out, spotting him amongst the crowd. She moved across the stall towards him, holding out 2 more balls of materia in her hands and thrusting them in Cloud's face.
Let me make a buck, why don't you? I'm sellin' materia. Why don't you buy some?
Cloud shook his head, and Yuffie quickly ran off to catch another customer eyeing the materia. Once again he thought he saw Yuffie slip the materia into her pockets, so he quickly slipped away and left Yuffie to her sneaky antics. The inn was built right next to the stalls, so he headed over to it. He doubted anyone would have bothered to check in, and with night fast approaching within the next hour or so, they needed to make sure they had a place to sleep. Pushing open the door to the Costa del Sol Inn, he was surprised to see that it was quite dark inside, a change from the bright outdoors, although it was a relief as well. Even so, the brightness of the outdoor sun had left his vision distorted, and everything he looked at had a green tinge to it. He blinked a couple of times but the shade just wouldn't shake, so he gave up and walked fully into the inn.
Ugh!
Came an annoyed voice from the side.
I feel god-awful.
Cloud looked over to his right and saw the innkeeper standing to one side, looking extremely fed up. As Cloud walked over he looked up, looking in particular at his unusual clothing and weapon. Then, as though recognizing him, his eyes snapped open and he pointed straight at Cloud.
Oh. You.
He said, making Cloud jump back in surprise.
Weren't you the one with that big sailor?
Cloud blinked. The innkeeper must have gotten him confused with someone else, for there's certainly no sailors among their group. They had all discarded their sailor uniforms back on the ship before fighting Genova.
Dunno what you're talking about,
he said evasively.
What's the matter?
The innkeeper looked around for the moment, before motioning Cloud to come closer.
Listen to this,
he said, and lowered his voice to a whisper.
All of a sudden, this big sailor just bursts in and takes over the restroom. He's been in there moaning ever since. I don't know what I'm gonna do.
He scratched his head, thinking.
Ah. If you're checking in, would you please pay his bill, too? Yo, Cloud.
Came Barrett's voice. Cloud turned and looked behind him, surprised to see Barrett standing a few meters behind.
Still too early, ain't it?
Barrett then turned and ran back, slamming the door of the restroom behind him. Cloud stared, sensing the pitiful gaze of the innkeeper behind him. A flush of thoughts ran through Cloud's mind as he pieced it all together. A big sailor locked in a restroom. It couldn't be Barrett. He shook his head vigorously, not wanting to think that Barrett was seriously considering keeping the sailor suit as pajamas or otherwise. It was not a pleasant thought. He said his hurried goodbyes and quickly vacated the inn, deciding that maybe he could book in later. Standing outside the inn, Cloud stopped for a moment to look around the town, his eyes once again having to adjust to the light. Up ahead he could see the shoreline and the beaches, and it was clear that the beach was packed with bathers. Red 13 was still fast asleep, his tail continuing to kick the ball back and forth across the ground. Yuffie was still selling materia, the crowd still large in front of the stall. There was not much more to explore, so he figured he'd find Tifa and Eris, who were probably on the beach. He found Tifa and Eris quite easily, probably because they were standing at the bottom of the steps leading down to the shore. They looked like they hadn't moved anywhere, and were whispering quietly to each other and pointing across the beach. They hardly even noticed when Cloud walked up behind them, and gently patted Eris on the shoulder.
Oh!
The girl shrieked, jumping about half a meter into the air and making the bathers around them look up in surprise.
Cloud!
Before she could protest any further about Cloud making her jump, Tifa ran to Cloud and grabbed his arm. She pulled him harshly forwards so that he could see across the beach.
Look at that!
She said. Cloud looked to where Tifa was pointing. The problem was that the sun was shining directly in his Mako blue eyes, and it was hard to see and it was making them glow more than usual. He shielded his eyes with his hand and looked closer to make out what Tifa was trying to show him. He stared a few seconds more, before he opened his eyes wide. At the other end of the beach was a large group of girls dressed in tight, bikini swimsuits. They were all draped around a deck chair, with a large umbrella shielding them from the sunlight. Lying in the chair was a man, whom they were all draped over. Normally this wouldn't be an unusual sight, except that the man was dressed in a long white lab coat, and had a head of shiny black hair and sharp glasses. It couldn't seriously be who it looked like. Couldn't be. Cloud narrowed his eyes again, focusing his sight.
Who, Hojo?
He asked, hardly able to believe his eyes.
Is that man over there, Hojo?
Tifa nodded.
Go over there and talk to him.
She gave him another push away from her, making Cloud almost stagger onto the beach sand. Cloud sighed and headed over towards where Hojo was sunbathing. He didn't even want to think about Hojo sunbathing, let alone why he was bathing whilst still wearing his lab coat. Even so, as he approached, he could see that the girls were draped all over him, clearly in awe as they sat around him. One of the girls looked up as Cloud headed towards them. She looked him over, clearly unimpressed, and rolled her eyes.
God!
She said sarcastically, clearly annoyed at Cloud's interruption of her fawning of Hojo.
What do you want?
Cloud raised an eyebrow.
I want to talk with that man,
he said, pointing.
Hey, who do you think you are?
She demanded, sitting upright. Cloud stared back at her defiantly, until she sighed and turned to Hojo.
Professor Hojo. That scary man says he wants to talk with you.
Cloud looked down at Hojo. The Shinra scientist had his eyes shut, his arms folded against his chest. He had known that since their encounter in Shinra HQ, when they rescued Eris and Red 13 from being more scientific experiments, Hojo had been missing. He never expected to find Hojo here. Until then Hojo had been resting with his eyes shut, and didn't even open his eyes as he said, "I'm busy right now," and turned his head away. One of the other girls began to run her fingers across his hair, making Cloud feel sick.
But, too bad,
Cloud said simply, folding his arms.
No, I remember you all now,
Hojo said suddenly. He opened his eyes and slowly sat up, adjusting his glasses and looking up at Cloud. Cloud's body was outlined brightly in the sunlight, but Hojo could see him all right.
Yes, yes. I remember now. It's been a long time, Cloud.
Cloud frowned, not interested in any pleasantries from Hojo. He remembered all too well the things that Hojo did, now and in the past. It was his scientific experiments that created the human-like monsters found in the Nibelheim-Mako reactor, and Cloud couldn't forget that. Hojo was ruthless when it came to his experiments. He looked up as Tifa and Eris ran up behind him.
Hojo,
Cloud said, trying to contain the anger in his voice.
Sometimes you just gotta do something like this,
Hojo said, lying back on the deck chair with his arms behind his head. Cloud and the others stared blankly.
What are you doing?
Cloud asked him.
It should be obvious. I'm getting a tan. Answer me.
Cloud snapped, ignoring the fact that Hojo's skin was so unusually pale that it would have been impossible for him to gain any sort of tan other than a burning red of skin not used to the sun. Hojo snorted irritably. He pushed himself upright and adjusted his glasses again, looking up at Cloud with a knowing smile.
I believe we're both after the same goal,
he said finally. Cloud blinked at him blankly.
You mean Sephiroth?
He asked.
Did you see him?
Hojo asked, looking up Cloud with such a gaze that it made Cloud feel slightly uncomfortable. Still, Cloud nodded, thinking back to Sephiroth's presence on board the ship. His nod seemed to satisfy Hojo's curiosity, and a smirk spread on his pale face.
I see. Ha. Ha.
Cloud, Tifa, and Eris looked at Hojo in bewilderment as he sniggered silently to himself. He gently waved the girls away from him and stood up, his lab coat hardly even moving away from his skin as he moved. The peculiar smirk remained on his face as he stood, and he quickly moved his hand over his smile to hide his knowing sniggering.
What is it?
Cloud demanded angrily, his hand itching to reach for his sword and put it to the egotistical scientist's throat. But there were far too many people around, and he would never get any answers if he killed Hojo outright.
Nothing,
Hojo replied, although it was clear that he was hiding something from them.
I just remembered a certain hypothesis.
He turned away for a moment, as though remembering more. He then turned and looked back at Cloud again, Cloud's image reflected in his glasses.
Haven't you ever had the feeling something is calling you? Or that you had to visit some place?
Cloud growled deep in his throat, his temper flaring.
I'll go anywhere Sephiroth is at,
he shouted, aware of the gazes of Tifa and Eris behind him.
To beat him and put an end to all this. I see,
Hojo said. He crossed his arms again.
This could be interesting. Were you in Soldier? Ha, ha, ha. Would you like to be my guinea pig?
He looked up as he saw Cloud reach for his sword, his fingers clasping around the handle, ready to draw it and kill him.
Oh, now what? Are you going to draw your sword? Stop, Cloud,
Tifa protested. She grabbed Cloud's arm and held it down, stopping him from drawing.
I know how you feel, but you mustn't.
Cloud glared back at her, but he knew she was right. As much as he wanted to, he couldn't kill Hojo. It was far too risky. So as much as it pained him to do so, he released his grip on his sword, and Tifa let go of his arm.
Ha! Ha! Ha!
Hojo laughed, clearly amused by Cloud's predicament. He stopped laughing the moment he saw Eris standing behind Cloud nervously, and he looked at her in surprise.
Say, aren't you the ancient?
Eris stepped forward.
I'm Eris,
she said, sounding a little annoyed but not afraid of him.
The least you can do is remember my name.
She walked a little closer, slightly hesitant.
I want you to tell me something, Professor Hojo. I know I'm an ancient. My mother told me. Your mother?
Hojo asked, confused. He seemed to think for a moment, and then he nodded as he remembered.
Oh, you mean Eifelna? How is she? You didn't know?
Eris said, sounding shocked.
She died.
Those words seemed to be quite a shock for Hojo. Clearly, he hadn't heard about that, even though it was so long ago. For once the narcissistic smile faded from his face and he looked almost sad as he turned away from Eris.
I see,
was all that he could say. Eris looked down. She had very few memories of her mother, but it was clear that, even as a subject of study for Shinra, Eifelna was very precious to a number of people. Even Hojo, who her mother worked hard to escape from, until she finally escaped and fled with Eris to the slums of Midgar. Then, with the last of her strength gone, she had collapsed, her dying wish being for Elmira to take care of Eris. Then she had died, leaving Eris only with her voice that she heard only from the planet.
Professor Hojo,
Eris said quietly. She pushed down her mother's memory and looked up at the scientist.
Is she Nova an ancient? Is Sephiroth an ancient? Do we all have the same blood?
She asked with such sincerity that Hojo seemed to feel even guiltier. It was important for Eris to know if she shared the same blood as Sephiroth, that they were descended from the same Cetra. He turned further away from Eris, unable to meet her gaze, and began to mumble something under his breath.
Head west. He's mumbling slowly,
Eris said.
That must mean he's hiding something.
Hojo looked back at them, the light from the sun on his glasses keeping them from seeing his gaze, although his expression was blank. Without saying anything more apart from a sigh, he lay back down on the deck chair, to the girls who were waiting for him. He mumbled.
Hey! Answer us!
Tifa demanded.
It's no use,
Cloud said with a sigh.
It's no go.
With that, Cloud turned and headed away from Hojo, leaving him with his little band of fangirls to fawn over him, although he couldn't figure out why. Maybe they were just girls who liked the look of authority. Still, it didn't matter to him, and he had already got the information he wanted. Tifa and Eris waited a moment before following him, now put off from the chance of swimming in the clear blue seas. Neither Tifa nor Eris were surprised to see what was going on in the town center of Costa del Solution. Yuffie was making a pile of money in her part-time job, and was clearly enjoying it. Her pockets were bulging, probably from all the materia she was sneaking in on the quiet. Cloud headed straight to the inn, leaving Tifa and Eris outside to shop in an attempt to lighten their own mood, but Cloud was in no mood for shopping. Talking with Hojo had really put him in a bad mood, so he was going to check in and stay there until the morning. The innkeeper seemed to be in a better mood when Cloud returned, although it was clear that Barrett still hadn't left the restroom. Yet Cloud could see why the innkeeper was so amused. The moment Cloud walked in he could hear Barrett's voice, loud and very clear, sailing in from the restroom.
Marlene. You okay?
The innkeeper sniggered to himself as Cloud walked over to the restroom. The door was locked tight, but there was a keyhole in the side, so Cloud bent down and peeked through it. He could see Barrett inside the restroom and, as Cloud had feared, he was dressed in the sailor suit from the Shinra ship. He was standing in front of the mirror, posing, and trying the outfit out in the so-called privacy of the restroom.
Dad'll wear this when I go to see you.
He stopped suddenly as he sensed someone standing behind the door, and caught a glimpse of blue beyond the keyhole.
Hey, yo!
He roared.
Someone's in here, alright.
Cloud stood up and turned away, deciding to imagine that he had never seen a thing. Instead, he went back to the innkeeper, who was still laughing under his breath at the noises coming from the bathroom. He was still smirking even when Cloud walked up to him, shaking his head pitifully.
Welcome,
the innkeeper said, trying to hide his humorous smile as Cloud walked up to him.
What's it going to be? 200 gil a night. You must be tired. Tomorrow in the Costa del Sol area, the weather is going to be sunny, again.
He smiled.
Cradled by the sound of the ocean waves. Sweet dreams.
It wasn't too long before the hot red ball of the sun finally began to slide down the sky towards the horizon, changing the clear blue sky to a fiery red color. Everything in Costa del Sol changed in hue to a deep red-orange. Many people gathered on the shore to watch the sunset, until the sun slipped beneath the horizon and allowed the gentle dark of the night sweep across the sky into a beautiful night sky. At about 11:30 the streets began to clear and silence fell upon Costa del Solution. All those who owned villas were safely inside, while the other guests were booked up in the inns. Tifa and the others had all booked into the inn at some point and were now safely tucked up in their beds. Barrett had eventually emerged from the restroom, no longer in the sailor suit, and was asleep also. Only Cloud had remained awake, even as the inn's clock chimed midnight with its softy, rhythmic melody that echoed around the quiet corridors. As the clock made its 12 melodic chimes to signal the hour, Cloud continued to lie back with his eyes wide open, his mind lost in thought. His sword lay against a chair on the single desk, along with the balls of summon and magic materia he had gathered. He couldn't stop thinking about what Hojo had said on the beach. "Were you in, soldier?" he had asked. Cloud couldn't help thinking what a peculiar question it was, especially since Cloud had never met Hojo before until that time in the Shinra building. Then, Eris had known Cloud had been in soldier, simply from the glow in his eyes. Still, the way Hojo had asked the question made Cloud feel very uneasy, and he couldn't shake that off. Somehow it even made him angry, although he couldn't explain why. He slowly turned his head and looked at the 3 summon materia he had gathered. Choco/Mog, Shiva, and Ifrit, some of the basic summons known. They were the most common and the easiest to master, but there were others more powerful in the world. He had no doubt that he would find them eventually, and they would need every bit in order to challenge Sephiroth. Turning away from the materia, Cloud turned over and looked to the window, which was open to let in the cool night air. It was still warm even with the sunlight gone, and the sky was still beautifully clear. There were quite a few stars in the sky, but many of them were blotted out by the night lights. Only in the countryside would the full beauty of the stars be visible. Towns and cities hid most of those sights, but it was still nice to look at. "Head west," Hojo had mumbled before he lay back down on the beach. Cloud had a pretty good mental map of the world in his mind, and he knew that the only way to get to the west part of the continent would be to go all the way south, to the southern mountains, and pass through them to the west continent. Of course, to pass through the mountains, they would eventually have to pass through Nibelheim and Mount Nebel. It was the only way, for Nibelheim was built right at the entrance to the mountain, its winding mountain path going all the way through to the west continent. He would have to see Nibelheim again, with its aged, burnt-down houses, and relive the memories again. Cloud must have fell asleep at some point, for when he next opened his eyes there was bright sunlight shining in through the window, with a cool morning breeze blowing in and making the curtains rustle. In an instant he bolted upright, wondering just how long he had slept and whether the others would be waiting for him. He left the room in a rush, his hair still tousled, but no one would really notice. The innkeeper was already at work behind the counter, going through his financial books. He looked up with a cheery smile as Cloud emerged from the room.
"Good morning," he said. "Be careful traveling. Your party has departed." "Oops. That's bad luck." "I mean, they have already left." Cloud nodded, said his thanks to the innkeeper and hurriedly left the inn to find the others, hoping they hadn't gone ahead without him. Thankfully they hadn't, for as Cloud finally emerged from the inn he spotted them standing at the far edge of the town, waiting for him at the entrance. Barrett was, as usual, tapping his foot impatiently against the sandy floor and complaining about the waiting, while Red 13 was crawling across the floor again. Yuffie, on the other hand, looked a little bit edgy. Eris was the first to spot Cloud. She jumped up and waved to him happily, urging him to hurry up. "What took you so long?" she asked as Cloud ran over. "Sorry," Cloud apologized. "About time," Barrett sneered, clearly still in a bad mood from yesterday. He looked at Cloud expectantly. "So? Where we headed?" "Hojo said something about heading west," said Tifa.
Cloud nodded in agreement.
Of course, we'll have to go south through Mount Corel first.
He looked at Tifa, who looked back at him with the same expression. She had also been up most of the night, thinking about the exact same thing. Until that point, Yuffie had been standing at the far edge of the group, keeping a close eye out on the stalls that were beginning to open for the day's business. The moment she saw Butch beginning to lift the covers off his stall, she jumped up and turned quickly back to the group.
Well, let's get going,
she said. Before anyone could protest, she began to push everyone as hard as she could out of the town, the grin maintained on her face. She didn't stop pushing until they were well out of view of the stalls and out of the town, just as Butch lifted the final covers of his stall, and saw the bare, empty bench.
Where's all my materia?
End of Part 3. Part 4, Bright Lights and Starry Skies. End of chapter. Episode 39, Part 04, Chapter 39. Part 4, Bright Lights and Starry Skies. Chapter 39.
Wow!
Yuffie exclaimed, her eyes wide in excitement.
It's so pretty.
Cloud and the group were all standing on the edge of a large ridge, taking a break after walking for over an hour or so across the grassy lands of the Costa Plains. Although the walk had been easy without the attacks of the toy-like monsters that lived inside one another, popping out at random times, it was still a tiring walk. The ground began to slope up the closer they got to Mount Corel, and although it was not noticeable at first, pretty soon it had become very tiring. They had reached the south of the northern part of the continent, where a large river separated them from the rest of the southern part. The only way onward was west, towards the entrance of the mountains. So they had decided to take a break on a ridge overlooking the river, where they could see the rest of the land. On the other side of the river was another large stretch of grassy land, with the mountains on one side and the vast ocean on the other. What had caught Yuffie's eye was a tall and shiny structure built right in the middle of that land, in the center of an equally vast patch of desert. It was strange to have desert growing in the middle of grassland, but it was the brightness of the tower-like structure that made Yuffie's eyes shine. From a distance it looked like a giant, oversized flower made entirely of gold, with a number of rounded, golden leaves sticking out from the sides. It looked entirely cut off from the rest of the land, apart from two large cables coming from halfway up the structure to where the first of the leaves was built, and down towards the mountains.
What is that?
Yuffie asked, letting her legs dangle off the side of the cliff.
I've heard of it,
said Eris, kneeling down beside Yuffie.
It's the Gold Saucer. It's a theme park. It's got loads of attractions, chocobo races, that sort of thing. I've never been there.
She turned back to look at Cloud.
Can we stop there?
Cloud shrugged dismissively.
We'll see when we get there,
he said.
First we have to get through the mountains.
He turned away and saw Barrett standing on the edge of the path winding up towards the mountain entrance. The elder man was the only one not looking at the gold saucer, and was tapping his foot impatiently on the ground.
What's wrong with you?
Cloud asked. Barrett looked over at him, and for a second Cloud thought he looked anxious. After that second had passed, Barrett's usual angry look replaced it.
Mind your own business, pointy head.
He snapped. He ran forward towards the edge, where everyone was looking at him.
Are we going, or are we wasting time sitting here?
After their quick rest they left the ridge and headed onward across the plains towards the mountain. It wasn't long until they were walking right alongside the mountain, following its trail to a second ridge where they could see the port town of Costa del Sol in the distance behind a small hill. From that point they could also see that they weren't being followed by anyone from the Shinra, and that most of the monsters residing in the area had not waken up yet. Still they kept on going, hoping to reach the next town before midday. A long mountain ran along the side of the mountain, artificially carved by workers aiming to join up the often disjointed fragments of the western continent. So a smooth, almost entirely level path had been cut out of the mountain, making it safe for travelers to cross. At the single point where the mountains separated to allow the river to flow between them, a strong wooden bridge had been built. Many travelers passed this way through the mountains to catch a glimpse of the waterfall, where water poured out of the side of the mountain and into the river. Yet the trail was a haven for cockatolis and needle-kiss birds that were known to attack unwary travelers, so they kept on going. Finally, they reached the spot they were looking for. In between all of the tall jagged points of Mount Corel, there was one smaller mountain with a ragged natural path riding all the way to the top. Crossing that path would take them further into Mount Corel, and hopefully towards the other side. Thankfully, after many years of use by traveler and miners hunting for materia or coal, the path had become quite smooth and safe to cross. They hardly had to climb at all apart from the odd spot where the ground swiftly raised upwards, and they had no choice but to climb over it. Even on the mountain path, there were still plenty of trees growing on either side of the path, their winding leaves and grass covering the sides of the mountain. The ground was also still soft beneath their feet despite the roots that grew up and across the path, and the faint touches of rock that joined the path to the mountain. Looking ahead, they could see the sun in its morning glory, a greenish light flickering between the trees and onto the floor, creating dancing patterns from the shadows of the leaves. The group were surprised as they climbed over one particular ridge. As they climbed up and looked ahead, they saw a man, obviously a traveler of sorts, sitting on a nearby rock and taking a break from the long haul up the side of the small mountain. He was just sat there on the rock, looking down at a map he had laid on his lap, and was muttering quietly to himself. He barely even looked up as Cloud and the others approached and stood near him, wondering if maybe they could ask for directions to save them wandering through the mountain.
"Huyo!"
the man sighed suddenly, wiping his forehead. He looked up suddenly and saw the group standing around him, and a wide smile spread on his face.
"Hey! You're actually talking to me?"
The group looked at one another, thinking that none of them had actually said anything to the man. Travelers were often reputed for being a little strange, talking to anyone whenever possible after many days of lonely traveling. This man had obviously been traveling for days, although he looked freshly washed, probably from the waters of the river. They couldn't really deny him his chance to talk to someone after a long time.
"What is it?"
Cloud asked. The traveler smiled again, clearly happy to have the chance to talk.
"I just passed a guy in a black cloak back there,"
he said, his brow creasing as he frowned at the memory.
"I just tried to tell him that it's dangerous up ahead, and he ignored me."
All sympathy for the traveling guy evaporated then, as Cloud spun round to look at his friends. A guy in a black cloak could mean only one thing.
"Sephiroth,"
said Cloud, confirming everyone's thoughts. There was another thing everyone realized right then, too. If the traveler was being truthful, for they were also known to exaggerate at times, then Sephiroth would not be very far ahead of them. He could still have been within the very same mountain they were standing on now, going in the same direction that they were. It seemed that Hojo was indeed telling the truth, despite how surprising it seemed. They were going in the right direction.
"Let's hurry on,"
said Tifa urgently, and the others nodded in agreement. They needed to follow this trail while it was still hot. Without saying a single word more to the traveler, they ran off into the mountain, their enthusiasm pumped up with the thought of catching Sephiroth while he was still inside the mountain. If they kept up a quick pace, they could probably catch up to him before he escaped. They ran on past the grassy path and onto the actual mountain path itself. They ignored the terrible ache of their legs as they pounded their way up the path, forcing themselves up and over the rocky ridges so that they could reach the top and head down deeper into the mountain. Hopefully to where Sephiroth was. In their hurry to catch up with Sephiroth, the group didn't even notice the quick and rapid changes in the scenery around them. Their minds were too intent on running to notice how the trees began to wither as they ran on, the brown of their trunks transforming into a dull and dreary gray as they struggled to hold on to life. The rocks beneath their feet turned the same familiar dead shade of gray, all of the life sucked from the ground to leave it blank. The only color came from the sun in the sky, still casting its green morning glow, although not even its life-giving energy could not touch the dead ground. The top of the path lay just ahead of them, and the group powered their way up to reach it and looked down into the heart of the mountain. They didn't stop running until they reached the very top, where they skidded to a stop and looked down before toppling in. Only then did they notice the dryness of the land and how dead everything had become the further into the mountain they headed. Thoughts of Sephiroth disappeared from their minds as they looked down into the crevice below, to the structure that was so horribly built at the bottom. It was a Mako reactor. A Mako reactor built deep in the heart of Mount Corel, in the location that was once a popular mining spot. Many tunnels had been dug into the sides of the mountain, paths for miners with trolleys who would dig up coal to take back, use and sell to other towns. That, of course, was a long time ago. Coal energy hadn't been in use since the discovery of Mako energy, so even here a Mako reactor had been built to replace it, and the miners were all long gone, taking the land with them. Barrett raised his gun arm and fired a single, solitary bullet towards the reactor. The bullet flew down and struck the metal of the reactor, even at such a great distance, and a loud ping resonated throughout the cavern, followed by the ricochet of the bullet as it fell to the ground and tumbled off the edge. Everyone turned to look at Barrett. They weren't surprised that he was angry at seeing another Mako reactor, sucking up all the planet's life energy, but they were surprised that he had only fired a single bullet at it. Barrett stood poised for a moment or two, looking out over his outstretched arm at the reactor. He longed to fire 1,000,000 bullets at it, tearing it to shreds with his own arm, or gun, whatever he could use. Just looking at the reactor as it stood there, the pipes running through the miners' tunnels to suck up the Mako from the planet, made him feel sick. Eventually, he lowered his arm, glared at the reactor for a few seconds more, before he turned away from the others and began to head down the path that led towards the reactor. The others watched him silently, and then followed him down. They had no choice but to pass the reactor. There was no way around it. The path they were on joined up to the metal bridges that wound their way around the perimeter of the reactor, so they had to walk right up close to the reactor's entrance in order to pass. Barrett remained entirely silent as they passed the reactor, barely even looking at it as he passed swiftly past without a single pause. He turned at the next bridge to head back towards Mount Corel, although this time they were on the other side of the river, where they needed to be. He was walking at such a rapid pace that it was hard for the others to keep up with him, but they had no choice. They tried to get him to slow down at one point, as they passed the reactor and back into the mountain. It was clear from the layout of the paths that miners had once used them. There were many sturdy bridges specifically designed for carrying coal, swerving up and down where the mountains temporarily ended to reveal a deep chasm. The wood creaked loudly under their feet, but the wood seemed to be sturdy enough despite its age. After a few minutes of walking across the bridges, Red 13 chose to run ahead to explore the immediate land ahead of them, to make sure that all was well for them to cross. There were many places where the bridges ran close and overlapped, as well as many places where the bridge broke apart with age. No doubt many miners would have lost their lives because of the wood's weakness. Thankfully, with the age of Mako energy miners, very few used the bridges, and less lives were lost. As they took a lower bridge towards the river, they spotted Red 13 again. He was sat back on his haunches, cleaning the fur of his paws with his tongue. He couldn't go any further because the bridge ahead of cut off, a drawbridge. Even though he was a canine-like animal with canine senses, he didn't hear Cloud and the others approaching. As such, he was very surprised when he finally caught their scent on the faint breeze, and the sound of their footsteps, and turned sharply.
"Wah?"
he asked, seeming confused. The cleaning of his paws must have been something to calm his mind while he thought about his predicament, but he calmed when he saw it was just the others.
"Oh, it's you. There seems to be an instrument in that hut that manipulates this bridge. Perhaps it's best if we rest a moment."
Everyone stopped and looked across the gap. They could see the hut on the other side on an opposite bridge, with the faint shadow of controls visible in its narrow slit window. The only way across to it was back across the bridges, and cross where they overlapped to reach the other side.
"Okay, then. Let's move on,"
Cloud said encouragingly. His statement was met with the sound of groans and complaints. As he looked round, the others were rubbing their legs and ankles, clearly in some discomfort after all the walking they had been doing across the plains, the mountain, and the rickety wooden paths. Even quickening their pace, they had caught no sign of Sephiroth, although they were sure he couldn't have got away so fast. Cloud looked around at the others again as they all sat down almost indignantly on the ground, clearly not prepared to move anywhere until the bridge was down. Which left Cloud the only one left standing. Sighing heavily, Cloud turned and headed back towards the rickety bridges, leaving the others behind to rest for a while. He soon found the perfect place to cross in order to reach the bridge. Where the bridges wound up and down to carry the trolleys of coal, the bridges passed close together with only a small gap separating them from the long chasm below. Even though the bridges stood so close together, Cloud took his time when preparing to cross them. After all, the wood was quite old, and although it had managed to hold them all when they walked across it, he didn't know how it would hold when he jumped across. Just looking at the beams, he could see the cracks in the framework, but it still looked sturdy enough. Cloud stepped up to the edge of the beam, making sure his sword and other items were attached securely. He avoided looking down as he stepped up, for it was a very long way down and he didn't want to even think of falling down all that way to a painful death. Pushing those thoughts aside, Cloud prepared himself for the jump. It wasn't that far a jump, not even a whole meter, but with the weight of the sword on his back he couldn't just stretch across. When he was ready, he stepped back on one foot, and then pushed himself off and jumped towards the other bridge. There was a very loud creak as Cloud landed on the opposite bridge, his boots pressing down on the framework. It turned inward slightly as his full weight landed on the wood, and Cloud was sure he could hear the sound of splinters breaking from underneath him. He froze for a minute, his body frozen in the position he had landed, arms out, legs apart, slightly crouched over. He wasn't even breathing, his ears attuned to listen for any sign of breaking wood. A full 30 seconds passed by before Cloud began to breathe again, choosing to take the risk as his lungs began to burn in need of air. Cloud relaxed his body at last, letting his arms fall to his sides as the tension subsided. Yet as Cloud relaxed, he unknowingly pressed down harder onto the wood. Beneath his right boot the wooden beam creaked further and a long crack split up the middle from where his boot was applying pressure. Cloud hardly even had the time to look down as the beam broke apart beneath him and his foot fell down the gap, toppling his balance. The other beam supporting his other boot broke just a millisecond later from the strain and Cloud fell down, breaking the other thinner beams that crossed the bridge and towards the chasm. Cloud reached out to nothing as he saw the bridge zoom past him, unable to comprehend anything as he fell. As the top of the bridge zipped past his eyes, a chest-breaking jolt made him jerk forward, and a sharp pain shot across his chest as the strap from his sword quickly rode up. Cloud lifted his head instinctively as the strap passed his neck and head and off his body altogether. He didn't know how he caught hold of the strap as he passed by, but somehow he did and he suddenly stopped falling. When Cloud opened his eyes again, he was looking straight down into the chasm, where he could see the rocky bottom of the mountain where the bridges had been built, along with his legs dangling above it. Almost choking a breath, Cloud looked upwards to see what had caught him. His sword was lodged horizontally in the wood above him, the blade caught on one end of the broken beams, the handle on the other. Cloud's hands had caught hold of the strap as it was pulled off his chest, and now it was the only thing stopping him from falling any further. Slowly Cloud swung his legs towards the other beams lining the wall of the bridge and began to climb back up onto the ledge. Thankfully the beams did not break any further, and the sword was lodged so securely in place that it did not fall down into the chasm. Cloud was so relieved when he pulled himself back on top of the bridge and sat down beside his sword. He was not shaking, but he was slightly pale at the prospect of falling down all that way. He then remembered that the others would be waiting for him to lower the bridge, so he shook himself off, picked up his sword and headed quickly along the new bridge towards the control hut they hoped would lower the bridge. The others were all looking up at the opposite bridge above them earnestly as Cloud finally passed by overhead. Eris spotted him first, a purple and blonde figure running across the bridge, and she jumped up and down enthusiastically, cheering loudly. The others looked seconds after that, shouting up words of encouragement to him as he ran on towards the hut. It seemed more of a shack than an actual hut, Cloud noted as he approached it. It was incredibly small, much smaller than he had imagined it to be. He found out just how small as he threw open the door and ran in, right into the controls. Before it hit the wall.
"Sure is tight in here,"
Cloud commented, feeling a little stifled in the packed shed.
"Come on, Cloud, don't let it get to you. Let's see."
Degree ow! Cloud cursed loudly as more sharp pains hit his leg, which he realized was the edge of a metal table containing the control panel. He put out an arm as he felt himself fall, but his arm didn't even reach 45. He ignored the claustrophobic feelings and looked around at the panels in front of him. It was all very simple. All there was in front of him was a metal table with a large metal box on it, containing an old wheel that was covered in rust. It was too dark in the shed to see how it was connected to the bridge, but it was the only device in there, at least that wasn't too rusty to work.
"This is it,"
Cloud said confidently.
"Maybe if I turn this, something should happen."
He reached out and tried to turn the wheel. It was incredibly stiff after years of neglect, and flakes of copper-colored rust broke off on his gloves as he gripped them. Realizing that it would take a much harder push to make the wheel turn, Cloud took a step back, then leaned forward slightly to grip the wheel again, and began to push with all his might. Finally, the wheel began to turn. A high-pitched screech echoed throughout the shed as more rust broke off the joints of the wheel and released it, letting it turn in short, sharp shots. Cloud felt his arm muscles burning as he pushed on the wheel, feeling it turn slowly. Outside, the wheel was beginning to have an effect on the bridge. The others looked on as the raised bridge shuddered slightly and began to lower itself down towards them. Eris and Yuffie cheered together as the bridge then lowered faster, until it finally settled down in front of them, connecting the two halves of the bridge together to make it whole. Moments later they saw Cloud emerge from the shed, rubbing the wrist that was still bandaged by Tifa, and turned towards the others, who were running across the bridge already. Instead of going back all the way across the bridges, and to avoid jumping over the bridges again, Cloud went up to the edge of the ledge he was on and slid down the side of the rock. He met the others as he reached the bottom, and they ran on round the side of Mount Corel towards the final bridge that would take them back onto the continent. The final bridge was much more secure than the other bridges, despite it being a rope bridge. The bridge stretched across another long chasm on the mountains, lowering down gently towards a final ledge near the foot of the final mountain. Many of the short wooden planks that made up the bridge had been replaced over the years, some still fairly new, so clearly people still used the bridge. Even the rope that joined the bridge to the mountain edge had been refreshed and was secure, so they were not too worried about falling off. Even so, they still held on tightly onto the rope handrail. Just in case. Barrett continued his silence all the way down the bridge, although he moved ahead of the others rather briskly, his large boots making the bridge shudder slightly. He ignored Cloud's protests for him to slow down and moved hurriedly ahead, almost deliberately, although no one could figure out why. Eventually they gave up calling to him and let him go on, where he reached the end of the bridge and ran off further ahead of them, disappearing behind a rock face. End of chapter. Episode 40, Part 04, Chapter 40. Chapter 40. When Cloud and the others finally reached the bottom of the rope bridge and onto the bottom ledge of Mount Corel, there was absolutely no sign of Barrett anywhere. He had run off somewhere, but they couldn't see him. Even when they called out to him he didn't answer them.
Barrett!
Tifa called. Her voice echoed throughout the mountain and sounded back to them, but there was no reply. She looked at Cloud, who shrugged back at her. He had no idea where Barrett was.
He is somewhere nearby,
Red 13 confirmed. He was standing on a large chunk of rock, his head high to sniff the air.
His scent is still in the air.
He took a deeper sniff.
There are others, too. Humans. And metal. But Barrett is definitely there.
He jumped down to Cloud.
Hey,
Eris said suddenly, running over.
Has anyone else noticed Barrett acting strangely since we entered Mount Corel?
Cloud nodded.
I always thought it was because of the Mako reactor, but it's not like Barrett to be quiet about it.
He scratched his head thoughtfully.
Normally he'd have a rant, going on about how much he hates the Shinra.
He thought silently for a moment, before he looked up at Tifa.
Tifa, you've known Barrett longer. What do you think? I don't know,
Tifa admitted.
I was part of Avalanche, but I didn't really know much about Barrett. I just ran the Seventh Heaven and kept people from intruding into the base. I didn't go on any missions until the number 5 reactor.
She turned away and walked to the edge of the ridge, looking down into the chasm.
Barrett never talked about himself much, other than his beliefs that the Shinra were killing the planet with their reactors. We, that is me, Jesse, Biggs and Wedge, never questioned him about it. We all shared the same hatred. Jessie had her own reasons for fighting the Shinra, her father was killed in a weapons experiment, and they blamed it on his incompetence, so her mother got nothing. Biggs and Wedge had their reasons too, as did I, Barrett. I've never asked what his reason was.
She turned back to Cloud, looking at him earnestly.
We just followed whatever he told us to do.
Cloud looked at her earnest eyes, and eventually nodded. He was about to say something to her when the sound of angry shouting echoed from ahead of them. Everyone jumped and turned towards the mountain path heading out towards the plains. Cloud signaled to the others to follow, and they ran down the path. North Corel. More angry shouts could be heard as they ran, all human, as Red 13 had said. They sounded very angry indeed, filled with curses of outrage and fury, but there was no sign of Barrett. They got closer and closer, until finally Cloud's team turned a corner and skidded to a stop, looking ahead of them. Barrett was standing just a few meters ahead of them between the mountain wall and what looked like the back of tent made of shaggy cloth. There were 3 men in front of him, a lot smaller than Barrett, but they had extremely angry looks on their faces. Tifa made to run forward, but Cloud put his hand out in front of her to stop her. She looked at him, but he shook his head. As they watched, one of the 3 men stepped forward and stood in front of Barrett. The edge of his mouth twitched slightly as he struggled to contain the emotions welling up inside of him. Finally he swallowed, before suddenly clenching his fist and swinging it forwards. It met Barrett's jaw with a loud crack, and the others all gasped in shock, Cloud grasping the hilt of his sword. There was a momentary pause as the man stood poised with his fist in the air, and Barrett's head tilted to the side from the punch, until the man finally lowered his arm and stepped back, his sudden burst of anger dying down just a little. Only when he stepped back did Barrett move again, but he made no move to strike the man back. He just stood there, his face blank.
Well, looky here.
The man who punched Barrett exclaimed mockingly, motioning to Barrett.
Never thought I'd see your face again. They kick you out of another town or something. You destroy everything you touch.
Barrett remained perfectly still, his arms flat by his sides. Cloud noticed that his muscles were relaxed, as though he wasn't even angry. Normally Barrett would have torn this man to pieces, but instead he just stood there and took the abuse that the man was throwing at him, ignoring the sneering faces of the other men.
You got a lot of balls comin' back here.
The man continued, the anger rising again as he clenched his fists. He turned sharply and motioned to the land behind him.
Look at this place. It's all your fault North Corel turned into a garbage heap.
He looked back at Barrett, who was still silent.
Why don't you say something? Or did you forget what you done here already?
The three men glared at Barrett sternly through their angry eyes. Barrett looked slowly from one to the other, hardly able to meet their gazes. Yet he accepted their condemning gazes in turn, before he sighed heavily and lowered his head to look at the dry, dirt-covered ground.
I'm sorry,
was all he could muster as a reply.
Shit.
One of the other men said with a grunt, looking down his nose at Barrett standing pathetically before them.
You ain't even worth the effort.
The third man nodded in agreement.
Don't waste your time talking to that techno freak.
He snorted. With that, the three men all turned around and walked away from Barrett, back into the garbage heap that they called North Corel. Barrett still didn't move as they left, and he didn't look up either. Behind him the others continued to watch, Tifa with her hand over her heart and a look of sympathy on her face, as well as confusion. Why did the men hate Barrett so much? She watched as Cloud released his hold on his sword and walked slowly towards Barrett.
You heard him?
Barrett said suddenly. Cloud froze. Barrett must have heard them approaching. He watched as Barrett sagged heavily once again.
It's my fault this town was destroyed.
Before Cloud could say anything to him, Barrett was up and off, breaking into a run towards North Corel and out of sight once again. He jumped as he saw Tifa run past him, trying to catch up to him before he ran too far. Cloud left her to it, she would probably have a better chance at catching up to Barrett than he or the others did. Still, he also wanted some answers. He turned and nodded to the others standing patiently behind him, and together they slowly walked into the town of North Corel. Entering the town, they saw why one of the three men attacking Barrett had called it a garbage heap. There was hardly anything left worthy enough to call it a town, other than what had been made out of rubble and rock and whatever else they could find. There were a few run-down houses standing, but that was all. Some of the houses had been built out of rock, made as best they could by the coal miners still living here. But other houses were merely tents made out of cloth that was barely able to keep out the rain. It was a complete contrast to the lively holiday resort of Costa del Sol, full of brand new buildings and bright, light colors. This place was mainly gray, like the mountain. As for the people living in North Corel, none of them looked very happy. Their faces were long and drawn with the hard times that had been forced upon them. There were few women around, probably in the homes making sure the children didn't play in the rubble. The men were outside either running the odd few stalls they had, or collecting bits of metal to try and make something that would get some revenue into the town. The stalls were not very good, the items they had were very basic, and some had clearly been repaired from bad damage, and it still showed despite their efforts. Cloud could see why they had built the town in this specific area. Travelers had no choice but to pass through when crossing the mountain. When Cloud and his friends walked past the stalls, they could see the hopeful faces of the people, praying that they would buy something to get even just a little bit of money in. Cloud wondered what had happened to these people to leave them in such a miserable state, but he felt he had a good idea. He saw Eris walk over to one of the stalls, an items stall. Even though there was nothing particularly useful on the stalls, Eris purchased a small bangle. She felt so sorry for the people, she just had to give something, and she knew they wouldn't accept handouts from them. The owner of the stall thanked Eris as she handed him the money, and Eris just smiled. She caught Cloud watching her as she walked away from the stall, and she shrugged. Cloud felt the corners of his mouth move into a faint smile that no one else could see, but Eris noticed it. She just beamed back at him, making Cloud tilt his head to the side in puzzlement. What was she smiling about? For some weird reason he felt a hot flush began to spread across his face, and he quickly turned away from her, scratching the back of his head.
Cloud,
said Red 13 suddenly. Cloud looked up, relieved to feel the flush fading from his face, and looked to where Red 13 was standing and nodding his head. Looking past the hound, he spotted Barrett and Tifa next to what looked like an air station. Sure enough, there was a sign nearby saying Ropeway Station. There was a large blue air cab standing on the rails attached to large cables heading away from the town. Tifa and Barrett were standing on the platform. Barrett turned away from Tifa as she spoke to him, but he didn't seem to be listening. Tifa looked up as Cloud and the others approached. She seemed relieved to see them, and Cloud was sure he could see tears in the corner of her eyes. She then turned back to Barrett, who continued to stand with his back to them, as though they weren't even there. Eris was the first to break the silence.
Barrett, what happened?
She asked simply. Slowly Barrett turned his head and looked at Eris, right into her calming eyes. Looking into the eyes of the ancient, he felt a pang of regret.
Sorry,
he said simply, still looking at her.
What happened?
Cloud asked, repeating the question just a little more harshly. Although he had pretty much guessed what had happened to the people of this town and what Barrett had to do with it, he wanted to hear it from Barrett firsthand. After all, he might have been wrong, although he doubted it highly. Barrett turned his head further and looked at Cloud's stern face, before turning away from them all again. He crossed his arms and tapped his foot impatiently on the ground, clearly trying to make a decision. Cloud in turn crossed his own arms and tapped his own foot, waiting for Barrett to hurry and make up his mind. He didn't have to wait long, for a moment later Barrett nodded to himself and turned back to them.
My hometown used to be around here. What do you mean used to?
Asked Red 13. Barrett shrugged.
It ain't here no more,
he answered.
Heard it got buried. In just 4 years. But how could those people say those terrible things?
Eris asked. Cloud glanced at her. Clearly she hadn't figured it out like he had.
And it's my fault,
Barrett said, making everyone jump in surprise.
All my fault.
The town of Corel was built at the edge of a small desert close to the edge of Mount Corel and its neighboring mountains. Being so close to the desert meant that the desert sands often blew in from the east and sent faint trails of sand across the streets, making it rather dusty. Even so, it was a calm and serene place. During the day when the women were at home taking care of the houses, and the children were out playing on the sandy streets, the men would venture out of the town towards the even smaller town of North Corel. North Corel was built especially for the miners who traveled from Corel each day, entering the mountains for a long day digging coal before returning home when the sun set.
My hometown, Corel's always been a coal mining town,
Barrett explained. He felt slightly awkward having to explain his own past, but he went on regardless.
It's so dusty, but calm and so poor. A real small town, this one. That's the first time I ever heard the word Mako reactor mentioned since that time.
The streets were quiet on that particular day, for it was a very important day for the mining town of Corel. Their mothers had taken the children inside, so as not to disturb the important visitors who had come in from the eastern continent in order to talk to the village leader. This meeting could mean big changes for Corel and its people, so they didn't want to annoy the visitors. There was a luxurious red car parked outside the main house, bearing the all-familiar logo that signified it as a Shinra car. Sure enough, standing outside the house and around the car were 4 Shinra soldiers, clad in their blue uniforms, helmets down to protect them from the gradually rising wind, bringing with it faint specks of sand from the desert. Wherever they could, children peered through their bedroom windows and looked out at the soldiers, both in awe and also in fear. Inside the hut, the meeting was well underway. Although many of the men had gone on to the coal mines for the day, the most important members and miners or the village had stayed behind and were in the village headman's house, along with the visitors from Shinra. Dressed seductively in her long silk red dress, completely out of place in the sandy town, and guarded by her own personal escort, Scarlet waited patiently for the leader's answer to her proposal. Barrett stood near to the couch in the middle of the hut, looking extremely anxious. He no longer had his gun arm, and instead had 2 normal-looking hands, slightly blackened from days of mining coal from the mountain. He looked rather anxious, for the meeting had reached a deadlock.
What are you going to do?
The village headman said suddenly, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had spread throughout the house.
The only one against this is Dine.
Everyone in the house turned to the man who was sat silently on the couch, his head lowered to avoid the gazes of the people. Like Barrett, his hands were slightly blackened from coal mining, but he did not have an anxious expression. His expression was defiant, almost hateful. When the Shinra made their proposal to build a Mako reactor in the mountain and replace their coal energy, he had immediately refused to cooperate. He had been mining all his life, like Barrett, but clearly he was the only one that valued its importance.
I am definitely against it, no matter what,
Dine said suddenly, lifting his gaze to look at the village headman.
There's nothing to talk about if you're thinking about throwing away our coal. Our coal's been protected for generations. Our fathers, and theirs before them, risked their lives for it. We have no right to throw it away so easily. But listen, Dine,
Barrett said reasonably, trying his hardest to make Dine understand. Dine was a very traditional man, with traditional thinking. Although he himself was also fond of their tradition as coal miners, he knew that things had to change for the better.
No one uses coal nowadays. It's the sign of the times. Right,
Scarlet said suddenly.
Everything is Mako, now. It'll be all right, Dine. Shinra, Inc. will guarantee your livelihood once the Mako reactor is completed.
Dine looked at her, clearly not convinced, although everyone else was.
Listen, Dine,
Barrett said, trying again.
I don't want my wife, Myrna, to suffer anymore.
Dine bolted out of the couch angrily.
I know how you feel,
he said, almost shouting in the house and surprising everyone.
I feel the same way too, damn it. But even so, I won't give away our coal mines.
He stopped shouting as he felt a hand on his shoulder, and he spun around to face the village headman.
Dine,
the leader said calmly.
You've got to understand.
Dine stared angrily at the village leader, until his eyes softened and he felt the grip on his shoulders slackened. Slowly Dine turned his head and looked at Barrett, and then gradually around at everyone else in the room. All the other miners had all made up their minds. Every last one of them, born and bred in Corel and spending all their days in the mines, were prepared to give up their coal in the hope of an easier life run by Mako. Through the corner of his eye he could see Scarlet's smug smile as she realized she had won. Dine also realized this then, and he sighed heavily. He let himself sink back down onto the couch, his thinner frame sliding easily into the soft cushions. He lowered his head to the ground. Like Barrett, his thoughts drifted to his own wife, Eleanor, and his young daughter, Marlene. Even with the coal there wasn't much money in the town, and Eleanor did have a hard time taking care of Marlene all those days by herself. If there was Mako energy, he would be able to spend more time with her, and her life would be easier. Dine sighed. He had no other choice but to give in. So, slowly, Dine nodded his head.
That's how the Corel reactor was built and completed. We all thought it would bring us an easier life.
An ear-bursting explosion sounded from within one of the houses of Corel. The window turned charcoal black just seconds before it shattered, sending shards of glass into the air. Flames erupted from the broken pane, followed by a cloud of thick, black smoke that poured out of all the broken windows and into the air. The smoke rose up in large, choking clouds and spread out over the town of Corel. All around the town, the rest of the houses were on fire as well, set alight by torches thrown in through the open doors, and flamethrowers that had targeted each house specifically. Nearly all the houses had fallen down, their frames lying in pathetic flaming shards on the ground. The flames continued to lick through the rest of the houses still standing, until they lost their own fight and crumbled to the ground. There were people running everywhere as the fire spread rapidly throughout the town. A few people who had made it out of their houses had fallen once they were outside, caught by either the flames or by the choking smoke. One man, who had just escaped the burning inferno that had once been his home, lost his battle for survival and fell face forward onto the ground, his last breath choked out of him by the smoke, along with the rest of his family.
It happened when Dine and I were out of town for a few days,
Barrett said. He looked down at the ground.
Corel was burned to the ground by Shinra troops. All the townspeople. All my relatives. Everyone. Everything. Shinra troops.
Cloud exclaimed.
What for?
Barrett narrowed his eyes angrily. The flames of the fire were almost burning in his eyes as he remembered seeing the flames ripping through his hometown.
There was an explosion at the reactor,
he explained.
Shinra blamed the accident on the people. Said it was done by a rebel faction. That's so terrible,
said Tifa in horror. It reminded her of Sector 7, when dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of innocent civilians were killed when the plate fell, all just to get rid of Avalanche. She closed her eyes silently for a few moments, a silent prayer to the many more people dead because of the Shinra. Now she hated them even more than before.
Well, I guess that's true,
Barrett admitted.
But more than Shinra, I couldn't forgive myself.
He folded his arms and turned away, his face sour as he pouted in disgust.
Never should have gone along with the building of the reactor. Don't blame yourself,
Tifa assured him, giving him a comforting tap on the shoulder.
We were all fooled by the promises Shinra made back then. That's why I get so pissed off.
The man shouted suddenly. His gaze fell down on his gun arm replacing his right hand. He placed his left hand firmly around the cold metal barrel, feeling the unnatural texture that should have been flesh, blood, and bone. It was so unnatural, an eternal reminder.
Not only did they take advantage of me, but I lost my wife, Myrna, too.
He went silent then, along with everyone else. In the background they could hear the sound of scraping metal across the rocky floor, able to guess what happened after the fire. The survivors, however many they were, left the burned ruins that was Corel and settled home in North Corel, saving whatever money they could to survive. Eris wanted to go back into the town and purchase a few more bangles, but Red 13 put his tail out in front of her and shook his head. The people of North Corel may have been poor, but they also probably didn't want the pity of outsiders. Eris looked at him, and then slowly nodded her head.
Hey, everyone.
Everyone turned to look behind them, towards the small office box that stood at the corner of the platform. A man was leaning out of the small window, looking at them with a look of impatience.
If you want to go to the gold saucer, hurry and get on.
Cloud looked around at the somber and somewhat weary faces of the others. Barrett had turned away from them all again, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, but he got the impression that he was glaring at the ground and cursing the Shinra in his mind. Tifa and Eris both looked down, their gazes to the floor, thinking about Barrett's story. He could see no expression in Red 13's face, and Yuffie looked like she wasn't even listening, turned away and polishing the sharp edges of her shuriken. Cloud remembered Eris asking him on the ridge before Mount Corel if they could stop at Gold Saucer, and he didn't see the harm in just going there.
Ride the ropeway?
He asked aloud. Eris looked up at him and smiled, clasping her hands together happily as she nodded her head firmly. Cloud nodded back, and headed towards the open doors of the air cab. When he disappeared inside, Barrett sighed heavily.
Dine was my best friend,
he said, half under his breath.
We was close ever since we was kids.
He shook his head firmly, shaking off the memory, and headed into the air cab after Cloud. Tifa, Eris, and Red 13 watched as Barrett disappeared inside the air cab. They half expected, and half hoped even, that they would soon hear Barrett's angry voice yelling at Cloud for some reason or whatever, meaning that Barrett was picking up and things would get back to normal. But as they waited, they heard no sounds coming from the air cab.
I never knew,
said Tifa softly.
Barrett never said a thing.
Said Eris. Said Red 13. Behind them, Yuffie was still busy polishing her shuriken with a cloth, her expression growing darker with every second that passed. Eventually she threw down her cloth and turned sharply to the others, her eyes glaring.
I'm not sympathizing with Barrett,
she shouted, so suddenly that it made Tifa and Eris jump. Red 13 slowly looked up at her as she shook her fists.
He never should have trusted Shinra, Inc.
With that she turned on her heels sharply and stormed off towards the air cab, almost throwing the door shut behind her, although with its weak handles it swung back open again. Tifa watched her go in, her face silent. She again began to wonder about everybody's reasons for fighting Shinra. She had her reason, just like Cloud had his, and Eris and Barrett, too. Even Red 13 had a reason, although Tifa wondered if he really did plan to leave the group when they reached his hometown, wherever that was. He had never said anything. She had to wonder about Yuffie, though. Even though it was clear that she didn't like Shinra one little bit, she had never said anything about that being her reason for going with them. In fact, she had quite literally forced herself onto the team, but no one had refused her. She was a talented fighter, despite being only 16. She was also a materia hunter, and she was good at her job. Tifa wondered what her true motivations were. She breathed silently. She looked down for a moment, before she forced a smile on her face and turned to Eris and Red 13.
"We better go on,"
she said, trying her hardest to sound cheerful. Eris looked back at her, and Tifa realized that she had been thinking exactly the same thing. Slowly Eris nodded, and the three of them all entered the air cab that would take them to the gold saucer. End of chapter.